I'd like to welcome everybody. We are here with a friend of mine, a scholar by the name of Dr. Andrew Loke, who, by the way, someone made a comment and said Andrew Loke on the resurrection is the most woke. So I told him I would make that comment for you. I'm really looking forward to jumping into this conversation because you've written an academic book recently that makes a genuine contribution in resurrection and apologetic conversations. And it's rare that this happens. I think on a popular level, sometimes you had people like J. Warner Wallace when he came out with his book Cold Case Christianity, was a real novel way of taking apologetics and translating it, so to speak, with fresh eyes. I think you've done the same thing on a scholarly level with your recent book, and we're going to put notes below where people can actually get that for free. And it's rare that I get a new book and I stop and I think, wow, this is a genuine, fresh contribution. So I wanted to have you on. Dr. Andrew Loke, we met in Singapore maybe 3 years ago when I was speaking at a conference out there, and I have followed your work. So thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks so much, Sean, for the invitation. It's good to see you again after all these years.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in the book that this took you 14 years to write this book. So I want to explain why this took you so long in a moment. But first off, to everybody, if you are new to the show, I'm Sean McDowell, your host, and this is in partnership with Biola Apologetics. So if you're new to the program, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have some other interviews coming up you will not want to meet. You will not want to miss. Definitely want to meet you there. So, Dr. Loke, tell us why this took you 14 years to write this book.
Okay, before I talk about that, I would like to start by saying that I first became interested in historical apologetics thanks to the work of your father, George McDowell.
Oh, wow.
Whom I would like to remember I'm very grateful for.
Wow.
And then, yeah, that's right. When I was still a teenager, when I first dedicated my life to Christ, when I was about 16, 17 years old.
Praise the Lord.
And then I joined Campus Crusade for Christ. Yes, and then I joined Campus Crusade for Christ and was very much involved in evangelizing and discipleship making. And then Josh came to Singapore to give a talk on evidence that demands a verdict.
That's right.
So I went to the conference. I was very inspired. Very glad to know that there's all this manuscript evidence, right, to show that the historical reliability of the New Testament, of the resurrection. And also the books that he wrote answered so many of my questions when I was looking for answers. So that was a great help to me when I was a teenager. And then many years later, when I was working as a medical doctor, and that was in 2006. At that time, the Gospel of Judas has just been published. And with the publication of that, the Gospel of Judas, there was a lot of interest, right, in the historical Jesus.
That's right.
And also a flourishing of all kinds of conspiracy theories about what the church may have hidden, right, from people. And so that got me thinking, because I was very interested in sharing the gospel with others, and I was thinking, how can I help my friends, right, to address all these different hypotheses about what may have happened to Jesus. Right, so I remember I was in my clinic one day, and after seeing a patient, I was thinking about this and praying over it, and then suddenly this syllogism came to my mind, and I began to realize that actually I can exclude the other alternatives to Jesus' resurrection using the logic, the laws of logic, the law of excluded middle, right? It's either this or that. Either there were people who claimed to have seen Jesus, or there were no people who claimed to have seen Jesus. Mm-hmm. And using this logical deductive method, we can arrive at that there's only these few possibilities, and then we can rule them out one by one and arrive at the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. So that was how I got my idea initially. That was in 2006. And then I went to Biola, right? And I did summer work on the resurrection with Mike Wilkins, and published a paper on that on the resurrection in 2009. I wasn't expecting to write a book on this topic. I thought I'll just publish a paper. But my friends encouraged me to expand this into a book. And so over the years, I began to expand it. And as I did so, I came to realize that more and more ideas emerge, right? So Mike Licona published his book in 2010, and then and so I tried to integrate some of his stuff, and so there has been a lot of work going on, and so that's part of the reason why it took me so long, right, to finally get this finished.
But that makes sense.
And to get it published.
That's understandable. Now, in this book, you take what you call transdisciplinary approach, where you look at psychology, you look at history, theology. So let me be the skeptic and say, what qualifies you to write a book that covers so many different areas?
Okay, so my background is in the sciences. I grew up studying the sciences, and my first degree was in medicine. And then I went to Biola. I did my MA in philosophy. And then I did my PhD in theology. And my PhD also covers quite a bit of historical critical studies as well. My first supervisor was Alistair McGrath, and my secondary supervisor was Richard Burridge, who is a very well-known historical critical scholar, most famous for his arguments, which shows that the Gospels are historical biographies, right? And so he was my secondary supervisor. So throughout my education, I have been exposed to different disciplines, and I guess this is what enabled me to think from different perspectives and to integrate all this together.
That makes sense. I think what I love about your book is your philosophical training comes through. And by the way, I did the MA Phil program at Biola as well. Love that program. And it's clear in this book that you are taking a systematic, step-by-step approach to the resurrection, looking at all the possible naturalistic hypotheses and ruling them out one by one. I've never seen somebody take such a careful, kind of methodical approach like this. And that's why I think you're making such a fresh contribution that's here. So let's go back and ask, what are some of the first naturalistic hypotheses that show up in the scripture? These aren't just recent. We see them in the scriptures at the beginning, don't we?
Yes, we do. In fact, when we look at the first century evidence, we find that the earliest naturalistic hypothesis was probably the one that when the Jews claimed that the disciples stole Jesus' body, right, and claimed his resurrection. So we find that in the New Testament. We also find that in the early 2nd century writing, the Dialogue of Trypho, written by Justin Martyr. So that is probably one of the earliest naturalistic hypotheses, right? How people try to explain away the resurrection by claiming that the disciples stole Jesus' body. And we also find in the 2nd century skeptic Celsus, right, who claimed that some of the so-called eyewitnesses may have hallucinated.
Yep.
They came to experience the resurrected Jesus. So these are some of the early ones.
Well, some people already asked. We have people in Kentucky, Tennessee, Hong Kong asking about the book. If you look in the notes for this live cast, we have a link to an article that has 2 different ways you can get the book, which I think you'll find really, really helpful. Now, let's start jumping into your process here to give people a sense of where you're going. And you have kind of a multi-step process. And you basically say, for this step, you have 2 options. And then you show that option is true. And then you say, the next step, there's 2 options. And one by one, you help us get to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. And your first step is whether or not people claim to have seen the risen Jesus. So here's the way you write it very carefully. You say either step 1, there were no people in the mid-1st century Palestine who claimed to have witnessed the resurrected Jesus, or the other option is there were people in the mid-1st century Palestine who claimed to have witnessed the risen Jesus. So essentially you're starting with the legend claim and ruling that out. So how do we know this whole thing wasn't a legend and people actually claimed to have seen the risen Jesus?
Yeah, so when we open up our Bibles, we will find that the Bible, there are many passages in the Bible, various passages which says that the disciples, the groups of people saw Jesus alive, right, after he was crucified, right? And but many people wonder whether those passages could it be added into the Bible after many years. So one popular hypothesis was what is found in the Da Vinci Code, right? So people thought the Bible may have been changed over time, such that the Bible that we have today is very different from the Bible that was originally written in the 1st century, right? So this is the legend hypothesis, right? People added in legends, right, in text, but that is contrary to the historical evidence, right? Because when we look at the historical evidence, we have plenty of manuscript evidence which show that which indicate that the Bible that we read today, right, especially those passages concerning the resurrection. So, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, for example, right, that passage is written in the first century, right? The text is that is basically the same, right, as what is found in the first century. And we can establish that on the basis of plenty of historical evidence, the manuscript evidence, and also the citation by early church fathers. So there are plenty of evidence which indicate that conclusion. Okay. And so having established that this text is written in the first century, we then need to ask the second question. Well, could it be that this is written by somebody who fabricated the information? How do we know that the author, Paul, for example, how do you know that he's telling the truth? How do we know that what he says is true? Well, I think there are at least 6 reasons why what Paul wrote is the truth. Now, the first reason is, which I mentioned in chapter 2 of my book, is that we need to understand the context. Right? Paul was addressing some skeptics in the church in Corinth. Right? So there were people who were skeptical about Jesus' resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 12, it says that there are some people who says that there's no resurrection from the dead. And in fact, this kind of skepticism was quite common in the ancient world. Most educated Greeks would not believe in that the afterlife is a kind of bodily resurrected state, because according to ancient Greek philosophy, after a person died, the eternal state, right, is a kind of soul, disembodied existence, right? So it will not be easy for them to believe that Jesus entered into the kind of state in a resurrected body. So they were naturally skeptical, right? And this is an important point because a lot of skeptics today, they think that people in the first century, they were very stupid, they were very superstitious, they would easily believe anything people say. But actually, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, I don't think that is the case, right? We see plenty of skepticism, right? Even in the New Testament itself, right? It indicates that the audience of the readers of the New Testament, many of them would not just easily believe, that Jesus was bodily resurrected. And so this is an important point that we need to bear in mind, right? That Paul is addressing people who are skeptical, and he needs to present the evidence, right? And secondly, and the second point is that we know that this is a life and death issue, right, for the earliest Christians, because the earliest Christians were persecuted, right? They have to be prepared, right, to give up many things, even their lives, right, for this faith, right? That's right. So it is not a trivial issue for them, right? This is something that needs to be taken seriously. And the resurrection is the foundation to their faith, right? And the third point, so given the first 2 points, that they were skeptics and this is a serious issue, people would want to find out whether there are people who really saw Jesus alive or not, right? People would want to find out, right? Yep. Because, And the third point is that people could find out, right? So people would want to find out, and they could find out, right? And we know that they could find out because we have evidence which indicate that, first of all, the Christian movement is a network of close communication, right? So people were traveling around, the apostles were traveling around, and these Corinthians, they knew the apostles, they knew them, right, personally. And so they could check with them, right? They could check with those people. Given and also we know that from the archaeological evidence that the ancient Roman Empire, the transport system is not too bad, right? People can travel around. That's right. And people do and many of the Jews would travel from different parts of the empire to Jerusalem for festivals yearly, right? So people do travel, people do meet each other, right? So people can check, whether there are these people who claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus or not, right? So given all these circumstances, right, and the other point is that this was written very early, and that needs to be emphasized as well. That's right. Because the historical evidence indicate that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15, it was around the year AD 55. It was within 25 years after Jesus was crucified, right, around AD 30. So during that time, many of these people would still have been alive. As Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 15:6, he says, among the 500, most of them remain until now, right? Okay. So these people are still alive, right? They can still be consulted, they can still be checked with. Yeah. So given this historical evidence, right, Paul says that most of these 500 people are still alive, inviting any reader to check the truth of the story by questioning the eyewitness. Now, Paul could never have done this and got away,
Good.
given the power, resources, and numbers of his enemies, if this was not true, right?
Good.
I mean, yeah,
Yep.
it'll be like me. It'll be like
Yeah.
me telling you that, you know what, Sean, George McDowell passed me a message a few days ago telling me that he and a few other people met with Donald Trump a few days ago, right? I mean, it would be so easy for you to falsify that, right?
It would be.
Yeah.
So
I won't be
let me jump in here, because this first point is about whether or not they claim to have seen the risen Jesus, whether it's legend or whether these are historical claims. And the point is that we have multiple early sources of people making claims that, when they're read on their own merit, are of actual bodily appearances, and these could have been checked out easily. I think that's a great point. Now, I know a lot more can be made from that, but that moves us in step one kind of to step two. And by the way, when it comes to legendary embellishment, one of the points that I think you make so helpful in your book is that you say people often claim from the earliest to the latest sources, you see this legendary development. But the earliest source we have, arguably, is 1 Corinthians 15, and it has the most appearances. So it's not what we would expect if this was purely legend. So let's move on. Let's move on to our second step, just so people get a sense of where we're going. And your second step, let me read it right here, is you say, okay, all of them did not experience which they thought was the resurrected Jesus, or at least some of them did experience something they thought was the resurrected Jesus. That's 2:1 and 2:2. How do you respond to that one?
Well, first of all, we need to understand the historical context again, right? So I emphasized just now that these people were willing to give up everything for their faith, right?
Okay.
Now, we know that there are a lot of people who will be willing to die for what they believe is true, right? Even though that may not be true. But you won't find a large group of people or groups of people who will be willing to sacrifice everything for what they knew is false, right? And be sent to hell by God for being false witnesses.
Yeah.
Right? So these people, these people, the earliest Christians, they clearly believe in God, right? They were very religiously devout. We see evidence of this, right? Plenty of evidence, right? In the letters that they wrote, right? They were praying, they were worshiping. They would rather die than to worship Caesar, right? Than to worship the Roman emperor. So these are the people who take their faith very seriously, and they believe in God, right? And they believe that if they lie, if they make up false witnesses, right? If they proclaim a false Messiah, right? They will be condemned by God after they die, right? So given that this is the case, they wouldn't have invented the claim that they have seen Jesus, and in fact they didn't see anything, right? So they must have seen something, and that's why they claim that they saw Jesus alive, and that's how they believe that Jesus resurrected. So this is the first point.
Okay.
And the second point is that if they didn't see anything, right? If they make this up, then why didn't anyone leak out the hoax? When they were tortured, right? Why didn't they say, oh no, actually I didn't see anything. I made it up, right? It's just implausible that they would just persist, right? In this lie that no one actually leaked out the hoax, right? When they were persecuted and tortured.
Okay.
And the third point is that we also have evidence in the earliest documents which indicate that these disciples, actually many of them were fearful or they were doubtful after Jesus was crucified. I mean, we need to understand that the crucifixion of Jesus was a very traumatic experience for many of them.
That's right.
So we need to ask, what is it that overcome their fear and their doubts, such that they went out into the world and bravely proclaimed that Jesus was alive. So these disciples must have experienced something that transformed them, right, from being fearful and doubtful followers into brave martyrs for the Christian faith. So they must have experienced something that transformed their lives.
So something transformed. I was honored that you quoted me a number of times in the book and my work on the apostles. But the point that you added is it's not only the possibility of losing their lives, but they would be judged by Yahweh as false witnesses if they start proclaiming a different God or different view of God, given their Jewish roots. I think that's a really, really powerful point to bring in there. So it requires something outside of them to transform them. And the best explanation you're saying is that they had some kind of experience that they believed was the risen Jesus. That's
yes,
excellent.
Right.
That makes sense.
And let me add,
Okay.
And let me add one more point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I thank you for your book. Your book is really helpful for my own research into this topic. And the other point I want to add is that the earliest Christians not only believed that Jesus is the Messiah, they also believed that he is the one, Jesus was the one, through whom all things came. That is, they believed that Jesus was the creator. Right?
That's right.
He was like a God, right? Of the same level as God the Father, right? That all things came through him. And this is utterly astonishing, right? Because we need to understand that the earliest Christians were ancient Jewish monotheists, right?
That's right.
They evidently hold that there's a sharp divide between the creator and the creature, right? Only the creator deserves to be worshipped, right? We shouldn't worship things which are created. So given that this is the case, why would they worship a crucified Jesus, right? So unless Jesus claimed to be God and showed himself, right, to be divine, right, by resurrecting from the dead, and such that the disciples experienced this, right, unless they have this kind of experience, they will not have come to the acknowledgement that Jesus is on the creator, the side of the creator-creature divide, right? They would at most maybe regard Jesus as a great teacher, maybe like someone like Moses or someone like Elijah, a great prophet. They don't regard Jesus, right, to be the creator of all things, and that wouldn't be plausible. And that wouldn't have happened, right?
I do love that you point out following a crucified Messiah. It was common for people who followed crucified messiahs to be put in harm's way, potentially being crucified themselves. That's what was at stake for them. So there has to be a sufficient explanation for this radical transformation. Now, the next point you say to is, okay, now, how do we know that these experiences were extra-mental? In other words, at this point, people say either they're inside their own minds, like hallucinations, or it's something outside of their minds. So for those who just joined us, Dr. Loke has written a fascinating book where he walks through all of the possible explanations for the resurrection, ruling them out one by one in a very systematic, careful way. And we've seen that they believed they had appearances of Jesus. This transformed their lives. Now the question is, do we have reason to believe that what they thought they saw about Jesus was not only inside their own minds, but actually in the world itself? So how do we know it wasn't some kind of hallucination or mental projection?
Well, first of all, it's not just one or two people who had this experience. Right? We have groups and groups and groups of people, right? At least 3 groups, which claim to have this experience, who claim to who have an experience the resurrected Jesus. And it is unreasonable to think that groups of people could have perceived somebody there when in fact there's no one there outside their mind causing their experience. Because intramental processes, since intramental processes is supposed to occur in the absence of external causal relation, it is unreasonable to think that the causal mechanisms internal to each person could have simultaneously generated a similar experience that is consistent with one another, right? That just doesn't work. And that's the reason why Gary Habermas has shown again and again that this collective hallucination, this is not found in peer-reviewed medical literature. We don't find this right in peer-reviewed medical literature. It doesn't happen, right? But even if it happens, right, even if group hallucination happen, it is extremely rare. It will be extremely rare. But here we have at least 3 groups of people, right? The 12, the 500, and then other apostles, right, experiencing something, right? So it will be implausible to think that all of this is caused by group hallucination. And I also mentioned in my book that even for cases of individual hallucinations, many people are able to achieve insight that their experience is hallucinatory after the experience ended, right? So hallucination is like some kind of intramental event, just like a dream, for example. So, for example, last night, I may have a dream that I went to Hawaii with my wife, right? When I had the dream, it may be very real to me, right? When I'm having it, right? It seems, I'm really in Hawaii. But after the dream is over, right? I realized that it's just a dream, right? I can check with my wife, right? Honey, did we go to Hawaii last night? Right? And she will tell me that no nonsense, right? We were not there, right? So we can easily confirm, right, with other people and to realize that it was just a dream. It was just something inside their mind. And likewise for hallucination, right? People can, the disciples could have checked with one another, and they would realize that no, this is this is just hallucination. This is something inside their mind, and so they would have easily falsified this, right? If it is not true.
So let me jump in here for a second. This is really, really helpful in terms of the nature of hallucinations are individual intramental experiences that, despite what the great movie Inception shows, you cannot share with another person. At least there's no good scientific evidence for group hallucinations in this fashion. So that's one really good point. The second one, and this was, I don't know that I'd read this before I went into your book, that you said oftentimes when people come out of hallucinations, they're able to reflect back on the experience and be aware of it and know if it affected them in some fashion and thus not have their beliefs changed by it. Is that correct? Did I explain that last point accurately?
Yeah, for most normal people, they are able to realize that a hallucination is a hallucination, right? If they had one hallucination.
Okay.
Unless all these people are some kind of schizophrenics, but then even for schizophrenics, they don't share similar experience too. I mean, one schizo may have his own experience, the other schizo may have his another experience.
Gotcha.
And when they check with each other, they will still disagree, right? They will say, my experience is not your experience. And if the disciples were all schizophrenics, they would also disagree with one another, and in that case, they wouldn't have come to the widespread agreement that what they saw together was a resurrected Jesus. I mean, that couldn't explain how they come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was resurrected.
That makes sense. And by the way, even mathematically, the odds that they would all be schizophrenics and have the same view is just, you can rule that out as being impossible. When you add James and Paul and the different appearances, it's not even remotely possible. Okay, so in the lineage we're working down, they claim to have seen something. This isn't legend. Transforms their life. Now we know it's not hallucinations or intramental. How do we know that it's, we saw that it's, so it's got to be extramental. How do we know that it wasn't a mistaken extramental appearance that wasn't really Jesus, that was maybe, say, a twin or somebody else? So now we're outside of the mind, but how do we know it wasn't some other extramental appearance of Jesus that wasn't really him?
Well, first of all, the disciples are people who were familiar with Jesus, right? They were not talking about the resurrection of a stranger, for example, right? They were talking about the resurrection of somebody who is their teacher, whom they have lived with, stayed with for at least a number of years, and so they were familiar enough with Jesus, right? And moreover, if they didn't identify carefully that, make sure that it was Jesus that whom they saw, they would not have proclaimed the resurrection and be willing to sacrifice everything for it, right? So they must have checked carefully, and they could check carefully, and they could identify if it's Jesus or not, right? And moreover, among them, we know that there are people like James, right, who his physical brother, who would have known if Jesus was a twin brother, James would probably have known that, right? And even if there was a twin brother, I think the twin brother would probably ran away, right, and to claim to be Jesus, right? Because given that Jesus was crucified, right? So any twin brothers would have ran away, right, rather than still came and said that I'm Jesus, right, and risk being crucified himself. I don't think the twin would be so stupid to do that.
Gotcha.
So and we have so many people, right, groups and groups of people, right? So it's just implausible that all of them just mistook another person for Jesus.
Okay.
And finally, the misidentification, this twin hypothesis, right, and doesn't explain the notion of the spiritual body, which we find in the earliest Christian, in the earliest historical documents.
Okay.
So in the letters of Paul, we find that Paul described Jesus' resurrected body as a spiritual body. It is a body that transcends normal physical body, right? And the accounts in the gospel describe that this is a physical body, but it can dematerialize. It can go through locked doors, right? It can suddenly disappear. So it has a kind of supernatural element that it is physical, but it can also dematerialize, like that. Okay. And I don't think any natural person any person can do that naturalistically. Not even a twin can suddenly just dematerialize like that. So this hypothesis
if it was some appearance of, say, Thomas or twin, that doesn't explain the descriptions of Jesus that had a physical body, but even greater than a physical body in the accounts that we have. So it just radically falls short in that sense. Okay, that's really helpful. So let me bring our listeners up. We're walking through this syllogism, ruling out step-by-step possibilities. The apostles believed they'd seen the risen Jesus, wasn't legend. This can't be explained by something that's inside them like hallucinations. They point to something outside of themselves, but there's no good reason to think that it was a twin or somebody that wasn't actually Jesus. That doesn't account for it. Then in your syllogism, here's what you say is the next possibility. Let me read it. You say, okay, Jesus maybe did not die on the cross, and maybe he came back and appeared to them. So the appearances in this case would be of Jesus, but they wouldn't actually be of a resurrected Jesus. Why doesn't that work?
Yeah, so, some people after reading the Da Vinci Code, they think that, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Maybe he just fainted on the cross. And then 3 days later, he somehow escaped from the tomb and tell people, hey, guys, I'm alive. And that's why the people are alive, because he didn't actually die. So that is... But however, that is utterly implausible, because we know that the crucifixion is one of the most cruel form of torture in the ancient world, and the Romans make sure that the crucified guy died, right? So it is very unlikely that Jesus could have survived the crucifixion. But even if Jesus survived, he would have been half dead. He would be severely wounded, right? And how could a severely wounded Jesus still manage to escape from the tomb? And even if he managed to escape, right, when the disciples saw Jesus in that state, right, bleeding, wounded, all right, guys, I'm alive, the disciples wouldn't believe that he actually resurrected. They would think that, well, this guy, he just he survived by chance, and he would need us to save him. We need to resuscitate him, otherwise he would die, right? So we need to save him. He couldn't be the savior. He's someone who need to be saved, right? So that wouldn't explain how the earliest Christians would have come to the widespread conviction that Jesus was the resurrected Lord. That couldn't explain how they came to worship Jesus. No way.
Okay.
And so half Jesus wouldn't have inspired them to come to the belief that Jesus truly resurrected. So this hypothesis doesn't work. Now, there's another hypothesis which has been suggested, which is that, well, maybe Jesus wasn't crucified. Maybe he escaped crucifixion. Somebody else was crucified, and then Jesus came up again 3 days later and tell people, hey, guys, I'm alive, right? Now, again, from a historical point of view, that wouldn't work as well, because the crucifixion was a public event, and the enemies of Jesus, the audience, many people in the audience would have been familiar with Jesus, right? So it's very unlikely that they would have mistook another person for Jesus and crucified that person in his place, right? And again, how would the Jesus be able to manifest this kind of spiritual body, which I described earlier on? So again, that would still require a miracle in any case.
Okay.
So neither of these hypotheses work.
This is really helpful. Let me sum up for our listeners what we're doing. We're looking at the claims in the scripture that Jesus appeared to the disciples. And we're looking at all the possible naturalistic explanations to account for this apart from it being true. So we rule out legend because the accounts are early, they're public, they're consistent. It's not mythological literature. We see that they're willing to suffer and die for this belief that they had seen the risen Jesus, so something radical had to transform them. And then we move to the question, is this an internal claim? And we rule out hallucinations, especially with your scientific background and medical background. There's no evidence for group hallucinations. It couldn't have been an appearance that was extra mental, like a twin. That doesn't make sense of so much the data of the New Testament as well, the way you describe it. And then the other possibility is, well, maybe Jesus didn't die, and then he came back and appeared to him. But the problem is the evidence for crucifixion is just too strong, and they never would have invented a crucified Messiah, because crucified Messiahs was the most shameful thing to happen. So let's move on now. Did I get that right? Did I sum it up decently well?
Yes, and the last point is that a crucified Jesus, who is somehow managed to survive and still suffering from his wounds, wouldn't have caused the disciples to believe that he is the resurrected Lord of life. That wouldn't happen.
So we know he was dead crucifixion-wise. All scholars virtually agree on that. But even if he wasn't, never would have convinced them to follow this religion. Super helpful. That's great. Okay, so there's not endless options to explain away appearances. That's partly what you're doing, is saying there's only so many options. None of these other options work. The best explanation is that Jesus appeared to them. That's kind of what you're doing here. So now we shift to the empty tomb, and you do the same thing, which I think is great. You say there's only 9 real possible explanations. Now let's take them kind of one by one, and I'm sure you have 8 or 10 points. You go into such depth in your book, which is helpful. But for each one of these, give me maybe 1 or 2 points why these explanations can't account for the evidence of the empty tomb. And then I see people, by the way, from Nova Scotia, Canada. That's awesome. We see people in New York, California. We're going to come to some questions as we get towards the end. So think those, write them down, and then we'll make sure you get a chance to ask Dr. Loke here. So here's the first one you say, is maybe Jesus escaped from the tomb, and that's why it was empty. Why doesn't that work?
Okay, before I talk about the empty tomb, let me first summarize the first part of my discussion on the resurrection appearances.
Great.
Because I think we have talked a lot, right? So let me briefly summarize for the listeners. And the argument is actually very simple in a nutshell, right? The argument is that the historical evidence indicate that in the first century, there were groups of people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive after he was crucified, right? And the evidence also indicate that these people, they truly saw something. It's not something that they made up.
Okay.
And what they saw is something outside their mind.
Good.
And this person who is outside their mind is not somebody else, but Jesus himself. And it was the same Jesus who was crucified and died and was seen alive again.
Okay.
And therefore, what these people saw was a Jesus who was dead and who was alive again. And therefore, this proves that Jesus was resurrected. He was dead and he was alive again.
Excellent.
So, in summary, that proves that Jesus resurrected.
Very good. That's super helpful. Let me jump in real fast. We got more questions about the title of the book again. This book is free on Kindle, or they will send you a PDF. If you go in the notes of this live stream on the YouTube channel, you can actually get it for free and download it. And I would encourage you. I've read it twice, and I'm going to go back through it again because it's so careful and thoughtful in the systematic approach. Andrew, that was a wonderful summary of the first step. Let's move to the empty tomb a little bit. We won't have quite as much time to unpack these as you do in the book. But again, there's only so many logical options that can account for the empty tomb.
Yes.
And one would be that Jesus somehow escaped the tomb.
So as I said earlier on, Jesus having heard the crucifixion wouldn't have the physical ability to somehow push away the stone and still manage to escape. I mean, that is just very implausible. But the main argument which I have for ruling out this hypothesis and also the other naturalistic hypothesis is my argument that there were indeed guards at the tomb. Right.
Okay.
So given that there were guards at the tomb, if the guards saw Jesus climb up from the tomb, I think the guards would just put him back into the tomb, and that's it. And that'll be the end of the story. It's unlikely that Jesus, who is still suffering from severe injuries, could have escaped from the guards.
Okay.
Actually, right? And so given that if there were really guards in the tomb, it's also unlikely that Jesus. If there were guards in the tomb, that indicate that Jesus was actually buried.
Okay.
That it's very unlikely that Jesus' friends, enemies, or any neutral party could have just stolen the body, given that there were guards guarding the tomb. They wouldn't risk their lives to try to steal the body away, and it's very unlikely that they would have succeeded anyway. So I think I think whether there were guards at the tomb or not is a very important piece of that is a very important consideration.
Okay.
And in my book, I offered a very long, I offered a very detailed argument to show that there were indeed guards at the tomb.
Okay. So that's only in Matthew, but you defend that pretty thoughtfully in the book in a way that's very helpful. And it raises some of the other problems, like if Jesus escapes, then all of a sudden he's a liar and he's still brutally hurt and wouldn't convince him. So I don't know anybody who takes that hypothesis seriously. What about the claim we hear somewhat frequently that Jesus was just thrown into a mass grave? So they go to some tomb, don't find him there, don't realize he was never placed there. He was just thrown in a mass grave.
Yeah, so this is a very popular hypothesis because it is a common Roman practice, right, to throw a crucified victim into a mass grave. This is something that is very often done in the ancient Roman Empire. Nevertheless, the Romans do allow for exceptions to that, right?
Okay.
So it is not that they must do this, right? And so they do allow for certain exceptions in certain circumstances. And in fact, people have, the archaeologists have discovered a guy whom they call Yohanan. I think he was crucified and he was actually buried. Yeah, so that shows that exceptions are possible. And so so on the one hand, I don't think that the argument offered by skeptics is ironclad. I think there are exceptions. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we have these arguments which shows that, as I mentioned in my book, I explained that there are good evidence for thinking that there were indeed guards at the tomb, and so this indicates that Jesus must have been buried, right, in the tomb, right, that is guarded by the guards, right? And so this would refute this unburied hypothesis.
Okay, gotcha. Good. One thing I found is all four Gospels report this. They agree broadly on who buried him, and there's no other account competing with this whatsoever. So we have good reason to believe he, in fact, was buried. And you go into greater detail. The next one would be, let me skip some of these just kind of for sake of time. What about removal by a non-agent? Like some people say a dog got the body, or an earthquake and it just fell through the cracks. Why is that unreasonable?
Well, again, if there were guards at the tomb, the guards would have chased away dogs or whatever.
Okay.
Right? And if it was an earthquake, and then the guards would realize that Jesus must have been buried somewhere under the earthquake, and they could easily, after the earthquake was over, they could easily uncover, remove the rocks, and find the body still there. And so, that would be very implausible.
Okay. Good. You didn't spend a lot of time because not a lot of people take that hypothesis seriously, which is good. Yeah. And it does. And remember, any naturalistic hypothesis or any hypothesis has to account for all the facts. So an empty tomb alone still doesn't account for the evidence for the appearances. That's a very important distinction to keep in mind that I know you make in the book as well. Okay. How about removal by friends? How do we know his friends didn't remove the body?
Well, first of all, we need to ask why would the friends want to do this, right? So it couldn't be for any serving motives because, as I said, the earliest Christians would have to prepare to face persecution, given that Jesus himself was crucified, right? So it'll be something. So it's not as if the friends of Jesus, by getting his body away, it's not as if they could have earned a lot of money or they could build an empire of their own with Jesus' dead body. I mean, that doesn't work, right? It's something very risky for them to do, right? So it couldn't be for any kind of greed or self-serving motives. And it also couldn't have been for any noble motives, right? Some people may think that, well, because they love Jesus, right? But if they love Jesus, then they would obey Jesus' teaching. Jesus taught them to not to lie, for example, right?
Fair enough.
And if you want to set up a religion, again, that goes against their ancient Jewish monotheistic background. Right? As I explained earlier on, the friends of Jesus, they were Jews, and they worship Yahweh, they worship the Creator. And they knew that if they create these hoax, right, they would be punished by Yahweh. They'll be condemned by Yahweh after they die, because they believe in heaven and hell, right? Even if some of the people here nowadays don't, but they do. They did, right? These are people who believe in heaven and hell. These are people who believe in God, and they wouldn't have created this lie and be willing to sacrifice everything for what they knew is a lie, and be willing to be condemned by God for creating a lie, right? For creating what they knew was a lie. So this hypothesis just doesn't work. And furthermore, they still have to get across the guards, which is, again, something very difficult to do as well.
So William Lane Craig doesn't focus a ton on the guards. It seems very central for you to rule out some of these empty tomb naturalistic hypotheses. Why is that? Is it because it's effective? You think there's a good case for the guards?
Yes, I do. But even if there were no guards, I think the argument for the resurrection of Jesus would still stand.
Okay.
Because as I explained earlier on, based on the historical evidence, we knew that the earliest Christians claimed to have seen Jesus alive right after he was crucified. And I already explained that the best explanation for that is that Jesus was truly resurrected. They saw a truly resurrected Jesus. So whether they were gods or not, right, that doesn't affect that argument.
Good.
The first part of the argument, right?
Fair enough.
So the argument for the resurrection of Jesus doesn't depend on the God. Nevertheless, I do think that there is a good historical argument that can be given for the guards, and I think that strengthens the argument further.
Good. Now, here's a question that came from Brando. He said, did they place guards outside other tombs or just the tomb of Jesus? Are there other historical records of the Romans placing guards at tombs in the way that we see in Matthew?
No, I'll need to go and check it out. I can't remember offhand. Do you, Sean?
That's very fair. You could throw that back on me. We know the Roman guards. This was the kind of thing that Roman guards would do, so it's not unprecedented. I've seen nobody dismiss it in that fashion. So it fits with what we know the Roman guards were capable of doing and protecting with their lives. So we do see that kind of evidence when we look in some of the other accounts. Let me keep going here. And then we're going to come to questions. We're going to save the last few minutes. If you have questions like this, I will throw them to Dr. Loke here. So we're running out of options for the empty tomb here. Another one is, what about the enemies? How do we know the enemies didn't? Maybe it was the Romans or the religious leaders. How do we know they didn't do it?
Well, if the enemies of Jesus took Jesus' body, then when the earliest Christians start to proclaim that Jesus is alive, the enemies of Jesus would have reproduced the body, right? Then they say, Jesus is his dead body is still here, and Christianity would have been refuted, would have been demolished right in the first century. I mean, the enemies of Jesus were evidently motivated, interested, right, to destroy Christianity, and that is why they bothered to crucify Jesus. Given that they bothered to crucify Jesus, they would have been bothered, right, to reproduce his dead body if they could, right? But they couldn't. They didn't, right? And so it is not. So it's not the case that they have taken the body. Right?
Okay, so when it comes to the empty tomb, we're pretty much out of options unless Jesus didn't die, which we already talked about, the swoon theory. Are there any other options for the empty tomb? I guess the only other route would be is somebody would deny the empty tomb completely and try to explain it away on other grounds. Is that the only option that's left when it comes to the tomb?
Yes, I think that's about it.
Okay.
And yeah. So I think all the options, as I explained in my book, right? There are only a few options. Either Jesus was not buried, or he was buried, right? If he was buried, then either he remained buried or he didn't remain buried. If he didn't remain buried, then his body is either removed by some non-agents like earthquakes or dogs or whatever, or is removed by agents, right? It's removed by human beings, right? Like friends, enemies, or neutral party. But we have already excluded all those, right? So there is no other option left.
Okay.
And so the conclusion is that the body was missing because Jesus resurrected. That's why the body was missing.
Okay, got it. This is really helpful. So let me sum up for our listeners what's going on. As we look at this claims of the empty tomb, and there's a bunch of independent reasons to believe the tomb is empty. The apostles are proclaiming an empty tomb. You look at the first speech in Acts 2. You look in Acts chapter 13. There's only so many options of what could account for the empty tomb. You take them one by one, and none of them are plausible to explain the data as we have it. They take much more faith, so to speak, than the claim that the body was actually empty. So you do this with other steps in the book as well that we don't have time to walk through, but I really want our viewers to get a sense of how systematically and carefully you look at the appearance claims, you look at the empty tomb claims, and you walk through every conceivable option, rule them out one by one, and show that the most meaningful conclusion is Jesus rose from the grave. So let me ask you this. Now that you have looked at these naturalistic hypotheses in depth systematically, more than anybody that I know, if you had to pick a naturalistic hypothesis, which one would you pick and why?
Now, before I answer that question, I want to add one more point. And the point I want to add is that the fact that the body was missing, this is further confirmed by the fact that even the enemies of Jesus acknowledged that the body was missing. Right? After all, as I mentioned earlier on, in the first century, the earliest naturalistic hypothesis was that the Jews claimed that the disciples stole the body. Right?
Okay.
So what this implies is that the body was indeed missing. Right? And so the empty tomb, the fact that the body was no longer there, is acknowledged not only by Christians but also by early non-Christians. Right? So this is this is another additional evidence that we can mention.
Good.
Which indicate that the body of Jesus was indeed no longer there. Right? And I already explained that the best explanation for that is because Jesus resurrected. All the other alternatives do not work. Now, coming back to your question, right? So you asked me, so if I were to choose one naturalistic explanation, what would I choose? This is a really hard question because I think that all of them do not work. Right?
That's fair.
And all of them will have to explain both arguments. Right? Not only do they have to explain the empty tomb, but they also have to experience. But not only do the naturalistic explanation have to explain the empty tomb, they also need to explain what was it that the disciples claimed to have experienced. Right? They have to explain both arguments, both set of data. And I don't think there's any naturalistic hypothesis that can explain either one of them.
Okay.
Satisfactorily, let alone both of them. Right?
That's really fair. By the way, Theo says, what about aliens abducting Jesus? Now, you actually talk about that, and somebody says, what about the wrong tomb? Now, you walk through all of these, and because of time, we're not systematically going through them. So I hope our viewers realize that if you want one book that walks through these different naturalistic hypotheses and responds to them, there's not another book out there like this. So tell me about the alien hypothesis, since it came up in the question, and it's always interesting. Everybody loves aliens. What's your take on that one?
Okay, so now, first of all, how would we classify the alien hypothesis? Now, to claim that some aliens took away the body would be to appeal to a totally unknown cause, right? Because we still do not have any strong evidence to prove that they were indeed aliens with such powers to take away bodies.
Okay.
Right. So what I have done in my book, right, is to exclude the naturalistic alternatives, right, to Jesus' resurrection, and based on how we know natural works, right, based on how we know, and based on our knowledge of the natural world, we can know that group hallucination, for example, right, it is not a reasonable explanation for Jesus' resurrection. So what I have done in the first few chapters is to exclude, right, all the known naturalistic alternatives.
Gotcha.
Now, so in chapter 8 of my book, I discuss hypotheses that invoke causes that we do not yet know, right? And so one of them would be the alien hypothesis, right? Now, with regards to the alien hypothesis, I think we will need to consider other factors. Now, first of all, do we have good evidence to show that aliens of such power exist? As I said earlier on, I don't think there is any good evidence or any good reason to think that such aliens exist. On the other hand, we do have good reason and evidence based on natural theology for thinking that God who created the universe exists. Right? And I have explained some of this evidence in my other book called God and Ultimate Origins. Mm-hmm. It is a book on the Kalam cosmological argument, which shows that there is a divine first cause of time who brought about the universe. And so, and I believe that in your show, Sean, you have also interviewed Stephen Meyer and others who have also talked about these arguments of natural theology, right? I think it was quite recently. And so these arguments will indicate that we have good reasons for thinking that a God who created the universe exists. So given that this is the case, given that Jesus himself claimed to be the one who is sent by this God, right? And that this God would vindicate his claim by resurrecting him from the dead, right? Mm-hmm. So given all this background information, we have better reasons to accept the conclusion that Jesus' resurrection was indeed caused by a God who could who created the universe and therefore would have the power to resurrect the dead, right? And this God resurrected Jesus as a vindication of his claim, right?
This is really helpful, by the way. I love that you start off this way, giving the background, and it shows that both of us did the Talbot Biola philosophy program. When I helped my father update his book Evidence, I did the same thing. I added some of the background evidence from the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning, the moral law, consciousness, to show that we have reason to believe this is a theistic universe in which mind is a part of it. That makes a kind of thing like a resurrection more probable and plausible, yet there's not a shred of good evidence that aliens actually exist. So to compare aliens with the Christian explanation is to really compare apples and oranges. Let me ask you, I just have time for one more. If you have other questions for Dr. Loke, throw them in here. We might be able to get one or two more other ones quickly. But one at the very end, what I thought is interesting is you start responding to the claims of like miracles are impossible, and you have a whole section on that that's very helpful. You also respond to the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Why do you, when it comes to the resurrection, there's something about that says, gosh, if I'm going to weigh my whole life on somebody dead, rose from the grave 2,000 years ago, that requires pretty good evidence. But you're concerned that the standard becomes so high we rule out things that we can know well. Did I get that right? How would you respond to the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
Yeah, so this is a this is a slogan that I very often heard from skeptics. They say that Jesus' resurrection is so extraordinary, and I will need extraordinary evidence before I can believe this, right? And so my response is that extraordinary events do happen from time to time, and when we consider extraordinary claims, we do need extraordinary evidence in the sense that we have to be more careful, right, to consider the evidence and to rule out alternative explanations. I think that is the key, right? We need to rule out alternative explanations. So let me give an analogy, right? So suppose I tell you that I saw a plane flying across the sky this morning, right? I mean, that is not an extraordinary claim. We do that. We know that planes fly across the sky very often, and so you can easily believe what I say, right, without demanding for more evidence, right? However, if I told you that I saw an alien this morning, right, an alien appeared to me this morning, then you would naturally be more skeptical. You would want to demand more evidence, right? And the reason why you want to demand more evidence is because you want to make sure that it is not due to other alternative causes, right? It's not due to, say, for example, me having a hallucination, right?
Yep.
Or just making this up, right? So you need to exclude the hoax hypothesis. You need to exclude the hallucination hypothesis. You will want to make sure that you have more evidence to exclude the other alternative explanations before you can accept my conclusion, that I already saw an alien. So it is the same thing when it comes to Jesus' resurrection. And what is extraordinary about Jesus' resurrection is that we do have extraordinary evidence to exclude all the other alternatives, right? Which I already explained earlier on, right? We do have good reason and evidence to exclude all the other alternatives, such that we arrive at the conclusion that Jesus was truly alive after he died. And so we do have extraordinary evidence here in the sense that we can exclude all other possible explanations and conclude that Jesus was indeed alive.
That's a really wonderful conclusion, and I don't know anybody who does it as systematically as you do in this book. That's what I love about it, because I have philosophical training. I want to know, okay, step 1, step 2, and really carefully look it through, and you do that in the book. Now, I see some other questions coming up, but if you want us to answer those questions, you're going to have to pick up a copy of his book. It's called Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. And by the way, it's free. Let me say that again. It's free. Now, in the notes of this YouTube stream that we're doing, if you scroll down there, there's a link to it. You can get it on your Kindle, or you can get it on a PDF. So, by the way, Routledge Press is actually the press that did my book on the fate of the apostles. So we have the same press here, and they're a very respectable academic press. This is not a Christian press in which you publish this book. So I think it's wonderful you got that research out there in a top scholarly book. I've seen you've done some other stuff with Cambridge University. I bring this up because, I teach at Biola Talbot, and we're proud of all our graduates. but we see the work that you're doing in areas of science and faith, also in the area of the resurrection. And we are super proud of you and just excited to see what is going to come next down the line as well. Those of you who are listening, if you want to be trained like Dr. Loke, and by the way, he had a lot of training beyond Biola as well. We can't take all the credit, maybe just a little bit of the credit. If you ever thought about getting a master's degree, we would love to have you come to Biola Talbot. What's that?
Yeah, I want to add that my training at Biola has been really helpful for me. It was the best training I ever had as apologist, and I will encourage all listeners, right? If you can go to Biola, if you have the opportunity to study apologetics, it will help you understand the Christian faith better and to realize that what we believe is real, right? And we do worship a living Savior. That his body is no longer in the grave, right? He is no longer there among the dead. He is alive.
Amen. Preach it. Well, we have a degree in science and religion. We have a master's in apologetics that is a distance program, and the philosophy program that you and I did. So if you're watching thinking, I'm not ready for master's program for whatever reason, we actually have a certificate program. We will help you work through with some of the same top tier professors. And there's a discount in the notes with for this live stream for watching this. You actually get a pretty significant discount. We would love to help you on that level if you can as well. Dr. Loke, hang on, don't leave yet. But for those of you streaming, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, give us a thumbs up. That helps spread the word through kind of the channels on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We have some other interviews coming up, including some debates by a leading theistic evolutionist and by a leading intelligent design proponent. This Wednesday, we have Craig Keener coming on, who's one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world. He has a new commentary that just came out. It's really coming out this week on the book of Acts. And I'm going to ask him all the tough apologetic questions from Acts. And he's one of the top scholars today, a dear brother. That'll be Wednesday night. We would love to have you join us. So thanks again, Dr. Loke. Really appreciate your time. Excellent work. I hope everybody listening here will pick up a copy of your book and help spread the word. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean. May God bless you.
Good night, everybody. Blessings. Thanks for listening in. Hope this was helpful.
Mm-hmm.